Welcome, everyone, to this IMS Leadership Conversations podcast. My name is Charles Good, your host and the president of the Institute for Management Studies. This podcast is designed to provide you with actionable insights and strategies that you can apply from discussing the research of esteemed leadership experts and practitioners. My goal is that what we discuss will be immediately actionable and useful to you. And I'd love to hear your comments from this episode, as well as what you are planning on implementing. My guest today is Deborah Grayson Riegel, who has been teaching and coaching on communication and presentation skills for over 3 decades. She's taught across industries and around the world, including at Fortune 50 companies, small but mighty startups, mission-driven nonprofit organizations, government agencies, and Ivy League academic institutions. She's also a regular columnist on leadership and communication for Harvard Business Review, Inc. Magazine, Psychology Today, and she is the author of several best-selling books. Welcome, Deborah, and thank you for joining me today.
I'm happy to be here with you.
Today, Deb, I wanted to focus on what I think is a critical leadership skill that's often overlooked and not properly understood, and that is giving and receiving feedback, which I know you're somewhat familiar with.
I'm very familiar with it.
So to jump right in, because I really want our listeners, I think we have listeners that are just new and emerging leaders. We have mid-level managers, we have senior level leaders, and I want them all to have a better understanding of how to deliver feedback effectively. So my first question to you, why do you think it's so difficult to give feedback?
I think it's really difficult to give feedback for a number of reasons. So first of all, most of us don't have a lot of great role models for it, right? So we typically learn skills and competencies from having seen it done well. Most people haven't seen it done well. So that's number one, is we don't have a lot of role models to learn from. Number two is we recognize that giving feedback can lead to hard feelings, especially when not done well. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, I'm sure. And so most of us don't want to cause a conflict. We don't want to hurt people's feelings. Many of us wrestle with our own credibility. Who am I to be giving this person this feedback? And in addition to us not having great role models, worrying about hurting other people's feelings, we also don't give feedback because in most organizations, you're really only expected to do it twice a year, right? Mid-year performance review, year-end performance review, and very few of us get better at things that we're only expected to do twice.
Right. So we're not practicing it enough. A lot of internal dialogue goes on. Like you said, a lot of people are non-confrontational, and when it's difficult feedback to give, that delays the process. And you're right, not having those role models that you can model that after to be better at. So with that being said, what are some of the negative consequences of receiving feedback non-skillfully?
One of the most negative consequences of receiving feedback non-skillfully is that you actually are in pain. And the research shows that our bodies and brains don't make a huge distinction between the impact of physical pain and the impact of feelings of social rejection. It all shows up as pain for us. And so when we don't receive feedback, well, number one is we get hurt, literally and figuratively. Number two, when we don't get feedback, we make a whole bunch of assumptions that range from, if I'm not getting feedback, I must be doing just fine, to what I'm doing doesn't matter enough for somebody to be giving me feedback, right? That whole range of when feedback doesn't happen well. And in addition, when we don't get feedback, we actually do not have data available to us to know what to do differently and when to keep doing because it's working.
Oh, that's great. Social rejection and that pain is just like physical pain. You're right. And I feel that it even lasts longer sometimes than the physical pain, because after you break your bone, after a month, after a year, you still remember it, but you don't feel it as vividly as you do social pain or rejection that you feel at that time.
Look, I'm 50 years old, and I remember being bullied in first grade. That is 45 years ago, and I can still feel that.
Yes, definitely agree with that. So with that, what are some now of the benefits? Let's talk about the other side, the benefits of having feedback-rich cultures done the right way.
So the benefits are huge. They are interpersonal, they are organizational, they are psychological, just every category you can imagine, there's a benefit to having a feedback-rich culture. And I want to just start by sharing what I mean by a feedback-rich culture, which is something that is a little closer to feedback every single week or more than 2 times a year. So a lot closer to 52 than to 2. That's what I think about a feedback-rich culture. And it also means that feedback is both given and asked for up, down, and across the organization. So when people have a lot of feedback and they're giving it up, down, and across, we see benefits that range from decreased burnout to enhanced immunity, which with 2 people in my house with COVID, give me some feedback. I want to grow my immunity right now. We also see that the business has better business impacts because people know how what they are doing impacts the business and have the opportunity to change or adjust that. And it also builds a culture of trust and psychological safety when you know that you will not be reprimanded for what it is that you say, including negative feedback, and that you believe that other people are committed to your growth and development. At the end of the day, when we get feedback from other people, we believe that we matter. And every single one of us has a need to matter.
Couldn't agree with you more. And that's so critical, that it's so pervasive, the effects of it throughout the organization that many people don't realize, but it has to be done skillfully. And you mentioned too, which I've seen in other research, that the amount of positive feedback to negative feedback should follow some ratios, right? So that people aren't always getting corrective or constructive feedback, but you're also praising them for things that they have done on a more frequent basis. So you had mentioned in one of your programs that it should be about 5-to-1 in terms of that positive versus, I don't want to say negative, but constructive feedback.
Right. And the way that I think about it is there's feedback of go do more of this, it's working. And there's feedback that's like, hey, that's not working, go do something different, right? So those are really the 2 categories. And we also know that even the word feedback causes anxiety for people. So I don't worry too much about whether we're calling it negative or constructive, because feedback alone has people go, oh my goodness, oh my goodness. But yes, you're absolutely right that one of the best and quickest and actually easiest ways that we can increase a feedback culture is to start giving people more positive feedback that says, this is what you're doing well. This is the impact that it's having. Keep it up. Go do more of that, or teach other people how to do that. And if we can increase the impact and frequency of positive feedback, where people know that we are regularly telling them what they are doing well and why it matters, we actually can stop feeding people the feedback sandwich, which is positive feedback, negative feedback, positive feedback. That's the kind of feedback we give when people don't have managerial courage and when they don't have trust. And even if you do it at the wrong time or the words don't come out exactly the way that you meant it, if you have feedback going on all the time, those things are less likely to carry as much weight than if you do it at the wrong time and you say the wrong thing and you are doing it infrequently.
Absolutely. Great stuff. And I think all leaders really that are hopefully listening to this can take this and use it. And as a result, give feedback more consistently over time. Once a week would be great, right? Establish that trust, establish that psychological safety with your team so that you can build that feedback rich culture.
Agreed. And if you can do it, if everybody is giving it to everyone, right? If we get in the habit of peer to peer feedback, right? Managing up feedback, all that kind of feedback, it really becomes something that gets baked in as opposed to something where we have to tighten our stomach muscles. Not that I couldn't use tightening my stomach muscles, but I don't want it to be around feedback.
Absolutely. So we've talked about the benefits of having a feedback rich culture. I would think it's safe to assume that many organizations don't have this. So to build this kind of culture, you need a process, you need a model to follow. And that's really what this podcast is designed to do, is to give those listeners, leaders that are listening to it, some actionable insights, right? So you state that before you give feedback, you really need to do 2 steps before having that feedback conversation, which I think is so critical and so many managers may miss or leaders may miss. And so if we could just go over those 2, because that first one I think is really critical, and that's asking for permission, right?
Yes. Ask for permission. And then the second one is state your intention. So let's start with ask for permission. If you are somebody's manager, it is an assumed part of the relationship that you're going to be giving them feedback. So you don't really have to ask for permission. What you do want to ask for is permission around timing. Hey, I'd like to give you a piece of feedback about the client pitch from last week. Would this be a good time, or should we schedule it for tomorrow? And one of the important things in asking for permission is to state what the feedback is going to be about. Because if you were to say to me, Deb, may I give you some feedback? I'm going to be, is it about the podcast we recorded? Is it about a program I just did for one of your clients? Do I have something in my teeth? Right? So my mind is going to go to lots of places and most of them dark. And so to narrow the scope of what the feedback is going to be about will help the other person put it into context as well. So if it's, upward feedback or peer-to-peer feedback, you probably want to ask for permission. Are you open to a piece of feedback? And if you're in a managerial direct report relationship, you're going to ask about timing.
Well, that's great. And I think this could be used in multiple contexts, right? Many of the people listening, I'm sure they have families. I'm sure they give feedback to their loved ones, as well as in a work context. So how would this be applied in that context, especially if, let's just say in this case, they don't want the feedback, right? You ask for permission, you say, is it okay for me to give you feedback? And they say, well, not really. I'm fine right now. Or they become quite resistant to it. What would be the next step in the process?
I think you want to look for patterns, right? So somebody being resistant once, you can notice that. Somebody being feedback resistant twice, you would start to ask yourself, is this a pattern? And then by the third time that somebody says they don't want feedback, you genuinely have a pattern. So I tend to look for patterns of behavior rather than one-off, in which case I would have a conversation about what I'm noticing about their willingness to hear feedback. So I might say, hey, I've noticed that the last 3 times I've asked you if I can share a piece of feedback with you, you've said no. I'm curious about that. I'd like to know what's beneath that. I'd like to get better at being a good feedback partner to you. Let's talk about that.
But it could also be based off of their past, right? Because maybe in the past, the feedback they've received has really kind of assassinated their character. It wasn't based on observable behaviors, but it was attacking their personality or something deeper. So that might be one of it, which brings me to the point where when you give feedback, right, it should be something that's observable to you. You don't make it a character attack. You don't talk about a personality issue, but you try to notice the behavior that they're not angry, but you raised your voice. You spoke in a harsh tone, stuff that they can relate to versus just expressing an emotion.
Yeah. And you are boiling it down to the fundamental difference between harmful feedback and helpful feedback. So harmful feedback tends to be about somebody's character or personality, and more helpful feedback is about somebody's behavior. So the example I often give is the difference between me saying, Charles, I've noticed that when it comes to follow up with the clients, it's taking you more than 2 business days. We've got a standard around here that we get back to clients within a day, right? So that is more helpful feedback. It's about an observable behavior, as opposed to me saying, hey, Charles, I noticed that when it comes to client feedback, you're really lazy about that, right? Lazy is going to hit a pain spot for you. It's different than, I noticed that it's taking 48 hours. We need to do this in a business day.
Perfect. Yeah. You use lots of great examples. One is about getting defensive, and defensive is not a behavior. Express those observable traits about what it means to be defensive, or why is this person being defensive based on what you've observed. So really break it down for them, even though you may think that it's known to them and they should understand what you mean. It triggers that internal response by them just to become more defensive as a result of what you just stated, versus identifying specific behaviors, right?
I promise you that nothing makes people more defensive than being told they're defensive, right? I mean, that is the number one, is take the word defensive out of your vocabulary when giving feedback and describe the behaviors you're seeing, right? I noticed that you explained to me the behavior. I noticed that you cross your arms. I noticed that you tell me why I'm wrong. Those are things that we interpret as defensive, but get rid of the word defensive. It doesn't help anybody.
Great. So I love where we're going with this. So the first 2 steps: ask for permission, state your intention, make sure you focus on observable behaviors. Now let's unpack some of this 5C model for giving helpful feedback so that you do it in the right manner. Because once again, I believe a lot of leaders, from new and emerging leaders, probably to senior level leaders, and all of our listeners listening, to be more successful, you got to give effective feedback, and you should follow a process or model to do that so that you're not just doing it off the cuff and you're really focusing on a proven way to deliver effective feedback. That 5C model, 5 parts, we're not going to be able to cover all of them. I'll just kind of give an overview, and then I'd love for you to kind of unpack maybe 1 or 2 of them with us. And let's start with that contextual piece, right? So that's the first step. Is there anything they can do with this feedback moving forward? And I love what you say. If there's nothing they can do with it moving forward, you may question that you probably, or the question you should have is, why should I even give it to them unless it can benefit them moving forward, correct?
Yeah. And we need to keep in mind that behavior change is really hard, right? So for anybody who has ever tried to quit smoking, lose weight, and start running, chances are they did somewhere between 1 and 0 of those things when they tried to take on 3. So if you are giving people lots and lots of feedback, make sure that it is something that feels important and actionable that they can use again. And just because you've got feedback in your mind doesn't mean that you have to give it. And if there isn't an opportunity for them to apply this feedback that you see coming up, you may want to exchange it for a piece of feedback that's more actionable and more pressing.
Oh, that's great. So why am I giving you feedback? Why am I giving it to you now? And how does it fit into the big picture? Are those key questions around that first piece of contextual? The other 4 are conversational. Step 2, make it clear, caring, and culturally aware. Love to talk about the second piece, conversational, a little bit, because with feedback, what I find and see in a lot of leaders is it's a monologue, not a dialogue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And especially when we're nervous and uncomfortable, which is true for many people when they give feedback, especially if they haven't had a good role model or haven't had training, something like that. They're like, okay, let me get together everything that I'm going to say, and then let me dump it on you, which is why people have terrible experiences with feedback. You've just been dumped on. And if you can introduce the feedback conversation as a conversation. I want to have a conversation about something that I observed in our last client meeting. And you say the word conversation, that already sets the tone. And then you actually have to make good on that commitment that it's going to be a conversation, which was, so I've just shared my perspective, and that's my perspective. I'd like to hear from you. What did you notice happen in that meeting? And then be quiet and listen to them. You may learn something that might change the feedback, or that might give you an understanding about what makes them tick or what happened in that situation. You really want it to be a very good combination of you sharing and you also listening to their experience and perspective as well.
So set that intent right from the start. You want this to be a dialogue, not a monologue. And what you say, which I agree with, the number one reason for not giving feedback is that you don't have enough information. You want to gather more information. And you very succinctly and expertly put it, it's, well, you don't have all the information. And the one perspective that you're probably missing is a person on the other side, right?
Yes.
Their perspective and their information.
So the number one excuse that I hear from leaders and managers is, I'm waiting to have all the information. To which I say, that is not a thing. You want more information, but that other person is the keeper of much of that more information. So that cannot be a reasonable excuse. Go talk to the person and get more information. There's nothing wrong with offering a piece of feedback, having the conversation and realizing you misunderstood, you were off the mark, there was more for you to learn there, and go, oh, as you were then, right? There's nothing wrong with that. That, in fact, demonstrates an awful lot of respect for the other person. If you have said it's a conversation, and conversations ideally are places where you learn things, that's going to be really helpful to your relationship if you're not always right.
Great. Love that. I think a lot of people are going to value this because that's, I think, is the number one reason why people don't have these conversations. And why not clear up these areas before? Like you said, if it was some misinterpretation on your part, why not know about it sooner rather than later so you're not having anxiety over this and you can move forward on a better footing with that individual. So critical to get these conversations happening and being more proactive with them, happening sooner rather than later. Now, as the dialogue happens, how can you be mindful of your tone during the conversation? Some managers, some leaders have a very authoritarian, dictatorial tone to them where they're just talking down to the employee from up on high, right? Where the employee, even though they know the manager has already stated to them they want it to be conversational, they don't feel based on the tone that it really is that way.
Yeah. And what I notice is that people tend to err on one end of two poles. So number one is too dictatorial and the other is so friendly that the person doesn't even know that feedback happened. Right. And so we want to be mindful of being somewhere within that range as opposed to saying, like, here's what needs to happen. Here's what needs to happen now, unless it is really the kind of feedback where somebody's going to get put on a performance plan. This is the third or fourth time you're having this conversation. Somebody's engaging in a behavior that can cause, reputational harm, financial harm, interpersonal harm, legal harm, right? Then you are entitled, you want to be respectful, but you're certainly well within your rights to take a more serious tone. I would, if you have gotten the feedback that you tend to be authoritarian or, very direct, I would practice having the feedback conversation with somebody who isn't that person and maybe who isn't even your close buddy. Like your close buddy is going to be like, yeah, you got this. But try the conversation with somebody who has a different conversation and communication style with you. And if your tone is one where it is so light that somebody doesn't even realize the feedback has happened, like it felt like a little spa retreat or a wellness getaway, what you want to do is also practice having that conversation with somebody and share with them, I want to make sure that I come across as very clear. And I'm going to give one trick or tip to those people who are so caring about the other person or demonstrate their caring that they use a lighter tone. Stop using the word we when you mean you. So one of the things that I often hear people say is, this is something we need to get better at. We need to make a change. We can't keep doing this. And they're using we to soften the blow and to demonstrate we're a team here. That we is very confusing. If you are holding the other person accountable for making the change and demonstrating the results, use the word you rather than we.
Great advice. I love this. This is gold. So just recapping, it's trying it out on a friend, a loved one, and having them give you honest feedback to see where you like. Because I definitely agree with you. A lot of leaders fall on one side of the spectrum or the other. They can't find that happy medium. And depending on the individual, especially if they don't have a good relationship with the individual, they might go toward the more direct dictatorial approach. Or if they really like the individual as a person, but there's issues with this person, maybe performance wise, they tend to be too friendly. And I love the fact that, just changing that one word, right, can make them feel like, okay, I'm holding you accountable. This is not a we, this is a you issue. And let's address it to try to move forward on that basis. Great stuff.
Exactly right. Yeah.
So the next one, and we kind of talked about this, the next piece of the model is clear. Focus on these observable behaviors. And I can't stress this enough because what I've seen with feedback is a lot of it goes into the character. You aren't focusing, it starts good, but then if that person on the other end becomes more defensive, then it tends to go down that road of, okay, here's what you are. You are a very defensive person. You're a very lazy person. You're not holding it up. And as a result, the person that's receiving the feedback gets more and more defensive and angry that, okay, this is not something I can change. They're now talking about who I am as a person.
Mm-hmm.
And now both sides are kind of at a stalemate.
Yeah. And a stalemate is sometimes an outcome of a piece of feedback, right? Sometimes you're going to get a piece of feedback that you don't agree with, and that happens as well. I would think about communicating the feedback in terms of here's what I've noticed or what I've observed. You do or not do, say or not say.
How often should they do that? Because if someone says that to an individual, say you're saying it to me, and then I come back with you and say, well, it only happened once or twice. Why are we having this conversation? It's not a pattern of behavior. Do you wait until you see a pattern? Or depending on the behavior, obviously, you have to address it either right away or you could wait a little bit. But how do you identify, and this really gets into the fourth step about caring, right? To check in on the impact you're having before you go too far down that road and they become too defensive. After you say it, should you say, okay, I just want to check, what's going on? Do you agree with this? Have you observed this yourself? Or are you completely blind to this happening?
Yeah. So I think there's a few things in there to unpack. So
Sure.
number one is you're absolutely right that we do want to look for patterns. most often. However, there are certain situations, right? I don't recommend that a leader wait for a pattern of homophobic behavior, right? Or, a pattern of taking money from petty cash. Remember when there was petty cash? Right. So there's certain things once is enough. And then other things where you really do want to start to notice if this is a pattern, and you need to be prepared to come with examples where somebody said that happened only once. Say, let me share with you what I've noticed. It was this time, it was this time, it was this time. You definitely want to be open to their understanding, their experience of it. I recommend that feedback recipients understand the difference between explaining and justifying. So explaining is,
That's
let
great.
me tell you what I was thinking. Let me tell you what I was going for versus let me tell you why what I was doing wasn't right. And you will get a better ear and better attention by saying, let me explain what I was going for, because maybe you had the very best of intentions, but the implementation was off or the impact was off. But standing your ground and saying, let me tell you why I'm right is going to lead to comeback.
That's a critical thing. I think that's so essential, explaining versus justifying it and really clarifying each for that individual so that that conversation gets a lot more positive feedback as a result or progress being made. So to demonstrate, so you have to check on the impact that you're having throughout the conversation so that it follows the process you want, has the intended effects. How do you work into that conversation their own personal life? Because usually if it's something that's constructive or corrective feedback, there could be other things going on within their life that are affecting them in the workload, in their work or in their job. So how do you show that level of caring and input these pieces into a conversation so they feel like my boss, my supervisor, this person really cares about me? They're just not uncaring, apathetic, and just wanting to correct this one behavior.
Yeah. Yeah. And what you're describing, which is so timely right now, is how do you demonstrate compassion while still holding people accountable for results?
Exactly. That's so critical.
Yeah. And so one of the ways to build this kind of culture we're describing is to make sure that your regular one-on-one meetings, which hopefully you're having, are not status reports, right? So many managers are using one-on-one meetings to say, tell me what you're working on, tell me where we are, what else are you working on next? And then they let them go. In my mind, that should be done by email. You don't need a one-on-one meeting for a status report. That can be done some other way. These one-on-one meetings, one of the best ways to use them is to find out what is going on in somebody's life that is impacting them at work. And that could be anything from, somebody at home with a health crisis to I'm planning a wedding, right? It doesn't all have to be bad news, but if you're using your one-on-one meetings to find out what's going on in somebody's life and you as a manager are even sharing to your level of comfort what's going on in your life, this will come as a surprise to you when you're having a feedback conversation, so that you should be able to work it in to say, look, I wanted to bring this to your attention. And Charles, I know that you're in the process of moving, and that takes a lot of mental energy and physical energy. And I'm just curious to know, how is what's going on at home maybe impact what's going on at work? So you should know. And the way that you know is to really take advantage of your one-on-one meetings or just to be checking in with folks regularly.
But I think you would agree with me too, that in this day and age, people feel more disengaged, disconnected. There's a loneliness epidemic with how work is being done, the work from anywhere. So having those conversations on a weekly basis, checking in on them to see how they are as a person, how is their life going, not just checking on their performance, is so critical if you want a high performing team and employees that really have trust in you, right? That you build that psychological safety of trust with these employees. What are some of the ways that you can build that and show more social care within these conversations so that when you do have a feedback conversation, it's more effective?
Yeah. Asking, listening, and remembering, right? So ask them questions about how they are, what's going on for them in their life. Feel free to ask more than once, right? So often people will say, I'm fine, and we let it go. Or somebody will say, oh, I'm feeling like crap, and we'll let that go because we don't want to pry. Ask more than once. Listen to what they're saying. and demonstrate empathy, right? I understand how that would be hard, or, oh, that does sound stressful, or, oh, how exciting. I'm so excited for you. I can imagine why you'd be energized about that. And then, you know, follow up. Follow up, make sure that you check in with them again, make sure that you ask, is there something I can take off your plate? You want to demonstrate that you are empathetic and caring. And you also want to remind people that they are accountable for the results that you've agreed upon, unless you are entering into a new agreement.
Great advice around that. So critical in this day and age. I think it's even more critical right now than it has been to do those checkups and check-ins and ask those critical questions. How about on the other side of feedback? When you're working remotely, when you're working from anywhere, and to stay motivated when feedback is scarce, when you're not getting enough feedback from your boss, from your supervisor, from your team, what are some of the steps you can take?
Some of the steps you can take when feedback is scarce is, number one is to ask for it, right? So we shouldn't assume that our boss is remembering, even though I would like your boss to be remembering. Ask for it. Ask for, what could I be doing differently? Where could I be making a greater impact? How can I demonstrate my engagement more? Ask for it from your boss. Number two is to ask for it and offer it to your peers, right? So we tend to think of feedback as a top-down engagement, and feedback-rich cultures have it going in every single direction. So you might reach out to your peers and say, I don't know about you, but I'm not getting a lot of feedback right now. How about if we plan to give feedback to each other, and also don't leave it too broad, make it really specific. So an example would be, look, one of the things I got in my last performance review is that I've got a bias towards action. And as a result, I miss details that are important. I'm going to really be focusing on this. Would you be willing to give me some feedback on what you notice and what are you working on? And I'll give you some feedback as well. So offer to create peer feedback units or cohorts. And then the last thing that I would recommend is give more feedback. If you want to get more, start giving more. We are wired, most of us are wired with a reciprocity bias. So if you start giving more feedback to your manager, and I would start with positive feedback, just to be safe, as you give more feedback to your manager, hopefully it'll be more comfortable for you to ask for it, or they will just give it out of reciprocity.
Great stuff. So if you don't give feedback a lot, some of the stories that occur in employees' mind are probably not the best ones to happen. So they feel like I'm not getting any feedback. Well, I must not be causing any trouble for my manager. I guess I'm doing fine. Why is that not a good story to have in your mind? Or why should that be corrected by the manager?
Yeah, so that's what I call the ignorance is bliss scenario, right? I haven't heard anything, so I must be doing okay. First of all, you don't want people to have to assume how they're doing. You want people to know how they're doing. This
Yeah.
goes back to something we said earlier, which is this fundamental need to know that you matter. In order for you to know you matter, people need to articulate and share with you the impact of what you're doing. And you certainly don't want to set up a situation where the only time you're giving feedback is when somebody does something wrong, because that is going to mean that they're anxious every time they hear you give them a piece of feedback, because it's associated with them having fouled something up.
Not only that, but in some cases, if you do it that way, then your superstars and the people that are doing really well don't get to hear any feedback. They feel like you're spending a whole lot of time to try to manage and correct those others when everyone needs more appreciation, right? And positive feedback. I don't think I've ever heard of someone say, you know what, I'm just too appreciated. I feel like I'm getting too much positive feedback. If anything, it's the opposite, right?
For sure. Although I would like to go to that club. I would love to be a part of that club called Everybody Loves Me. I Can Do No Wrong. I don't think it exists.
Right.
But yes, you're absolutely right. And when we ignore our top performers, we are actually negatively reinforcing positive performance. And that's why people leave. One of many reasons why people leave.
Hit the nail on the head right there. Love that. The two other scripts that they normally have when they're not getting the feedback is maybe my manager doesn't feel like I'm going to take it well, right? Or they don't think I can change. So talk a little bit about those two scripts in their mind and just give the leaders to say, okay, here's why you don't want your employees thinking that.
Yeah. Well,
Besides the obvious.
yes. Well, let's talk about the grain of truth in it, right? So if you're the feedback recipient and you haven't taken it well, right? You've shown up in ways that were less than professional in it. You got to own that for yourself as well. So I would think about, as the feedback recipient, is my manager perhaps justified in believing that? As a manager, you want to articulate to this person, if you have had a pattern of feedback with them where they haven't taken feedback well, you may want to talk about that. Hey, I noticed that the last 3 times I gave you feedback, you said, yes, you were going to make the change, and then you didn't. That feels concerning to me. Let's talk about how you can make the feedback more actionable. I caught myself saying we there, not the manager's responsibility. And I would say from the feedback recipient's perspective, you might need to manage up and say to your manager, I know the last couple of times you gave me feedback, I didn't take it as well as I should. Here's what I'm learning and what I'm prepared to do differently. And then offer the opportunity. Can we set up a feedback meeting? Because I'd like to have the opportunity to really listen to feedback this time, or to demonstrate that I'm ready to make a change, do something differently. So this is really a partnership. The onus isn't on any one person. These are 2 people who need to engage in this conversation professionally and effectively.
That's great. Love that. Love what we talked about in this episode. We started talking about why giving feedback is so difficult, some of those negative consequences, identifying those 2 steps that we need to have before the feedback conversation, ask for permission, state your intention, and then going through and unpacking a little bit of that 5C model of giving feedback, which is so critical if you want it to go well and move forward with it. And I think all leaders can practice this, because no leader is the art and science of giving feedback. No one does it perfectly. You might do it great with someone that you feel comfortable with and know, but a lot of times when it's a new person, when it's someone that you've been having difficulties with, then that's where you start getting to be less effective in giving feedback, and the effects that you want to have, the results really don't happen. So a lot of great stuff in this. As we reach the end of this episode, I always like to end it with a call to action. Deb, is there anything you would recommend leaders starting with first? I know for me, it's giving feedback more frequently, not waiting twice a year or just for the negative corrective feedback, but making sure that I acknowledge those individuals that are doing something right on a frequent basis.
Yeah. I would say you're right in line with what I recommend is the most actionable step, which is to start giving more positive feedback more frequently. And if you're wondering where to start, look at your organization's core values and start giving some feedback around seeing people live out those core values and put them into action.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us, Deb, and remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you.
You can get in contact with me on LinkedIn, Deborah Grayson Riegel. I'll be the one in the fuchsia jacket. You can find me on my website, deborahgraysonriegel.com. And yeah, I think those are 2 good places to start.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again for joining us today. And this concludes this episode of the IMS Leadership Conversations podcast. You can send us your feedback at info@ims-online.com. If you'd like to subscribe, this podcast can be found both on Apple and Spotify. It can also be accessed on the Institute for Management Studies website at ims-online.com. And until next time, remember, it's not what you know that makes a difference, but what you do consistently.